What happens when a homegrown Catholic influencer joins a far-right media network?
We're unpacking Matt Fradd's move to the Daily Wire and what it means for Catholicism, masculinity, and online radicalization. You're listening to Whiplash, a listener-supported podcast produced by Max Kuzma and Emma Cieslik, lifelong Catholics and members of the LGBTQ community.
We explore Catholicism through the lens of queer liberation theology, and we're so glad you're here to join us. Today, we're diving into a story that hasn't gotten as much attention as it deserves. Catholic podcaster Matt Fradd joining the Daily Wire.
Right. This is the first time we've really seen a homegrown Catholic influencer make the jump to a bigger network in this modern social media age. On the surface, it might seem like just a prestige career move for him, but it actually has some significant implications for how faith, masculinity, and politics intersect online.
Absolutely. Over the years, Fradd's content has leaned heavily into topics like authentic masculinity and leadership, often echoing ideas from the broader manosphere. Now, with a bigger platform, those ideas are reaching even more impressionable young Catholic men.
And that's where the radicalization comes in. Platforms like YouTube reward content that's more extreme, creating feedback loops that can push young men toward increasingly reactionary ideas, even when it's framed through faith.
Yes, and the way this content is framed, conflating moral certitude with political ideology, is shaping how listeners think about faith, gender, and power.
In this episode, we're unpacking how Fradd got here, why his audience is so receptive, and what it means for the future of Catholic media and masculinity culture in the U.S.
Before we get started on discussing these spheres of radicalization and Catholic pipelines, we need to trace this back to the beginning. In true sense of where I find my greatest joy, I'm going to put my history hat on for a second. Not about the history of the Catholic Church, but rather an Australian-born speaker, author, and podcaster named Matt Fradd. He was born in Sydney while his father was serving in the Australian Navy, but he grew up in Port Pirie, South Australia. Raised in a devout Catholic family with a particularly faithful mother and grandmother, he attended Mass weekly. But as a teenager, he found it boring and eventually became agnostic, openly questioning the existence of God around the age of 13. That all changed, however, in 2000 at World Youth Day in Rome. Fradd said he was expecting a party, but instead experienced a profound spiritual conversion that brought him fully into the Catholic faith. He went on to study philosophy at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in the United States, earning both undergraduate and graduate degrees, and later an honorary doctorate. During his early ministry, Fradd met his wife, Cameron, while serving with Net Ministries in Ireland. They married on August 12, 2006, and together have 4 children. Today, the family attends Eastern Catholic Mass in the Byzantine Rite, which Fradd discusses openly and widely on his own media platforms. Fradd built a career as a speaker and author, addressing tens of thousands of teens and young adults on topics like apologetics and confronting the impact of pornography through his website, theporneffect.com. He is especially popular not only among a growing number of young men and young women that are converting to Catholicism for the very same reasons that he was attracted to it, for this very ritualized sensory experience, and one that's rooted in intense history, but also thinking through this association with radical traditionalist Catholic identity is especially important to his popularity and his reception online. On December 6th, 2017, he began co-hosting a podcast called Love People Use Things with Noah Church, an atheist. The show focused on fighting the dangers of pornography and ran until late 2019, releasing 49 episodes. In 2018, Fradd launched The Matt Fradd Show, a Catholic long-form discussion podcast. In the following year, he reoriented perhaps his most well-known project, Pints with Aquinas, turning it more into a long-form discussion rather than focusing exclusively on the theology, philosophies, and writings of Thomas Aquinas. The podcast has ranked number 16 in the United States in the religion and spirituality category, and number 25 in Christianity. Over the years, Fradd has hosted many influential figures in the Catholic Church, from Father Mike Schmitz, Jason Evert, Donald Calloway, Jimmy Atkin, and Scott Hahn. He has also contributed to Catholic Answers and published with Ignatius Press, with his work appearing on platforms like Father Mike Schmitz's Ascension Press and Formed. His association and friendships with these, and collaborations rather, with these other Catholic figures, sliding into the feeling of podcasters and influencers, is part of a growing Catholic sector of the Manoverse. Now, before we get started on continuing our discussion of Fradd's stories and where his podcast is picked up by a far-right secular mainstream media company, we have to discuss what the Manoverse is. So far as it's understood now, the Manoverse or Manosphere, depending on who's writing about it, refers to a conglomerate of internet, podcaster, and influencer culture online, often focused and targeting young men and boys, centered on ideas of patriarchy, misogyny, and sexual-based violence. So it's often the conflation of many different movements, from the Red Pill movement to patriarchal violence movement to men's rights movements. All of these elements conjoin together in the Manoverse that seeks to consolidate the power of often white men, but not necessarily, in this movement that not only is talking about social and cultural control of women's bodies. We saw it best after Trump was elected president, and many men turned online under the slogan, "Your body, my choice," but also at the same time around this idea and entry, this pipeline, as we'll talk about in a little bit, into far-right American politics. So the ways in which they exert and enforce this social and cultural control over women's bodies and over the bodies of other people, including members of the LGBTQ plus community, is through navigating and harnessing white supremacist and Christian nationalist power. So the Manoverse is very much kind of capitalized and manipulated a growing generation of young men that are looking for leadership and for models in a world that increasingly is challenging a way of life that privileges and prioritizes their comfort, that is challenging a way of life that privileges their authority, their control, and their unchecked power in a movement best exemplified by not only Catholic members like J.D. Vance, but also perhaps the best example of Donald Trump in the presidential office. With that being said, the Manoverse and a Catholic version of that is essential to Fradd's rise within and adoption by this secular far-right media company. So this past week, Pints with Aquinas has been picked up, as Fradd announced, by the Daily Wire. It's a media company that was started by Orthodox Jew Ben Shapiro and Jeremy Boring, himself an evangelical Protestant minister. It's known for being a very far-right media network that has promoted specifically xenophobic, racist, sexist, and queerphobic messaging. And it's one that has concerned people. With Fradd's move to the platform and fear that he's potentially selling out, given that there are Catholic pundits that exist on the Daily Wire, but a number of them have left because of differences of opinion with the initial creators of the media company, but also fear about what this means for the many young men who he's amassed as a following.
100%. I think that's so well said. And the Manoverse and the Manosphere, I never know, Emma, which one to use. I'm like, is it just whichever one you prefer? Are there like distinct branches and flow charts of thought on this? Do you know?
Well, and it's a good question because typically the Manosphere was the first iteration of what it was, of kind of these, and it came from the idea of the men's rights, the red pill users. But I think the Manoverse was especially popularized because there was a piece from the New York Times right around the time that Trump was fighting for his third election, his second successful one, that called out Trump courting the Manoverse. And so I think it was trying to talk about the idea that Manosphere itself is creating specific ecosystems and spheres of influence online versus, as the Manoverse is stating, it prioritizes the idea that white men are meant to be centric and innate to the power of political spheres. So everything should revolve around them. So I think there's slightly different meanings, but a lot of people use them interchangeably.
No, that totally makes sense. Like manosphere is like the actual space or the environment, and manoverse has this idea that men are the center of the universe, kind of. Is that kind of?
Totally. And it could be, it's so nuanced to try to understand like the etymology of these different words. But I think Manoverse also, at least from my perspective and how I'm interpreting it, refers not only to like the manosphere being online spheres of influence, but the Manoverse being how this connects to political and cultural movements. So it's the reason that this is not just a conversation that's happening on Reddit, that's happening on Discord, that's happening on X. This is actually an ongoing political machine that is affecting how people are voting and acting in real life.
100%. And I don't think at this point in what we have seen with like Trump's second presidency, I don't think anyone would really argue at that point, because like you can see the actual consequences and the examples of what these people did once they were in power. And perhaps the best example that I'm thinking of right now is, I think Andrew Tate in the world of the Manoverse is kind of known as a lightning rod, or maybe one of the most popular examples. And, it might be that some people know Andrew Tate's name more than they know Matt Fradd's name, even within Catholic circles. Like, he was much more of a well-known figure. And then we saw Trump pardoning him, or wanting to allow him to be integrated into society, despite all these criminal allegations against both individuals. So I just bring that up because I think it's definitely like, this is a very real phenomenon, a very real space, and oftentimes people seem to think that Catholicism is sort of like outside of some of these things. Like, well, Catholicism is its own thing, it's its own culture. But the truth is that, even if you want to try to be set apart from culture, you are still part of it. What is that? There's that famous comic where it's like, you are part of a society. Like, you cannot like eject yourself from the society, because you are in it and you are operating within it. Like, you have to live within it. We live in a society. That's what it is, I think.
100%. We live in a society, and also denying that we live in a society with certain rules is veering on and claiming that we live in a society and society gives us and enforces the morality that we practice is the dangerous realm of moral relativism.
Yes. And so, but I think what Andrew Tate and Donald Trump, and potentially now Matt Fradd with some of these trends we've seen, that the pattern that we're picking up on, it's this concept of weaponizing white male discontent. And that's another thing that, you can just see with the second Trump presidency, because pretty much all of the policies attack all marginalized people. The attacks on DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion, it's because they don't want anybody other than white men to hold positions of power. I mean, statements and comments by pretty much everybody in authority, all the men in authority, like JD Vance and Pete Hegseth. And this also ties into Charlie Kirk, who we will talk about a little bit more later. Charlie was like famous for the whole thing about like, if I got on a plane and I saw a black pilot, I wouldn't trust that I was going to get where I was going, which is just so racist. Like, it's just pure racism. And there's definitely an element here of like, well, he's not afraid to say it. He's not afraid to say it out loud. And you get like this collection of guys who want to hide in the shadows behind these people who represent what they think is their, I don't know if it's interest is the word I was looking for. They think that these figures represent their interests, when in reality, they often enact policies that then are harmful to that group. Like, for example, the farmers of America, who suddenly all their like major parts of their businesses, like 30% of their business completely dried up due to Trump's tariffs and ongoing wars with other countries over economy and trade.
100%. And I really like how you put that. And I want to highlight one thing of, I think there is often an assumption in the Manoverse and Manosphere that the men who are leading this movement, I know you cited Andrew Tate, he was specifically kind of a part of this like growing like Catholic and Orthodox like Manoverse sphere that we
True.
talk about a little bit, because he converted to Orthodox Christianity before becoming an atheist and then later converting to Islam. But from his perspective as well, it's this assumption that these men are saying long held truths and beliefs of men that just haven't been socially permitted to be set up.
Right.
Um, and it's, and I think it's often the danger that these people are seeing themselves as these revolutionaries and key liberators of young white men that they argue have been oppressed by modern society, in which their rights are not questioned, but rather the innate privileges that allow them to abuse and assault other people's bodies.
100%. I totally agree, Emma. The phrase that came to my mind that I have heard many, many times, unfortunately, when I was growing up, is men are just that way. That's just how men are. And that, in the Catholic fundamentalist bubble that I grew up in, we could trace that line of thinking as emerging from like complementarianism and gender essentialism. But you can also see how that also is integral to all the stuff we're talking about right now. Like, I see the line through to this idea that some of the things that Donald Trump said on a tape was just locker room talk. This idea that, men are, there's this idea that the rules of society like don't apply to men for some reason. Like, men are just wild and crazy and can't control themselves, and that's, again, that also feeds into purity culture. I mean, this is a little bit of a rabbit trail here, but I think it's all like interconnected.
No, I completely agree. And this also ties to this idea and this culture of boys will be boys, where
Yes.
violence, both verbal and physical violence against women, against marginalized communities, are viewed as excusable because of grandfathered in white male power. And because of that, is as we talk about, often when we bring up this conversation with Matt Fradd, there's a hesitancy to apply it to him, especially because Fradd has for so long been talking about Thomas Aquinas. Now, my feelings on Thomas Aquinas and how he has also been part of this white supremacist complex development throughout the history of the church, all set aside. But Fradd himself is feeding into and fostering a connection between Catholic young men that see him as a leader within this theological realm, that see him as a leader of Catholicism, and so view his shift to the Daily Wire as a legitimization of his work and also of his connection to these far-right political views.
100%. I also just want to say one last point, which is that you mentioned red pill. And I think red pill comes from this meme that originated from the film The Matrix, where there's two pills that are offered. One is blue and one is red. And taking one continues you into a deeper understanding of the world, where taking the other kind of just lets you go back to disassociating and just existing. And so a few points I want to make about that. First, it's very interesting because you often see that type of sentiment coming from conspiracy theorists as well. This idea that, well, we actually understand what's really going on here. Secondly, it's part of this idea of red pilling being absorbed by far right people is part of a larger movement where they tend to absorb things into their sphere that did not originate from their sphere. So The Matrix is a film that was created by two people who are trans women and in many ways has been discussed directly by them as an expression of their experiences of navigating identity. So I'm not going to say outright it is a trans allegory authoritatively, because this was before they started their transition. However, it was an expression of them navigating and understanding their identity. And there are some very literal allegories to the trans experience throughout the film. And also, like, you know, they are trans women, so they are the authorities of the thing that they created. But I just think that that stuff is interesting, the co-opting of something, and like it reminds me a lot of how, again, within fundamentalist Christian and Catholic spaces, it's like we have to like take everything and make it Catholic or make it Christian, and it's like, you know, things are just things. Like, we don't have to like grab everything. There's space for everyone to be who they are. And that truly reflects a more just society and world. And I would add that our last two popes, Pope Francis and now Pope Leo, are both men who understand this global perspective and this need to hear from everybody and have space for everybody, and honestly to respect the dignity of people who are different from you, even if you don't, you know, have a touch point for how they're different. You still have to respect.
100%. And I also want to highlight that this ties in not only to arguing what is to be a true man and what it is to be a true Catholic, but it's also inherent to an idea we've touched on previously in our podcasts of purity tests, of when we talk about the manosphere, just as you say, the red pill or the black pill analogy is supposed to refer to whether or not people want to hear the harsh truths. But within this manosphere, the harsh truths are believed to be like supposed ideas about gender roles and gender and sexual norms. So with that being said, it ties into the idea that not only is this an enforcement and aggression towards outsider communities or people they deem outsiders, including women and people that are gender expansive, but also against their own community members. So as we saw in adolescence, even within the film that came out on Netflix, or the short series that came out on Netflix, a lot of these manosphere and manoverse cultures are not only harmful to the people around it, they're harmful to the people inside of it. So just as you're going to talk, Max, about Matt Fradd and his own connections to kind of these purity culture elements, we also have to think about how within Catholicism, his own connections to radical traditional Catholicism is a way in which he is policing not only gender roles, but also what it means to be a true, authentic Catholic.
1,000%. And, you know, sometimes I'm just like, does everything just come back to gender? Because like, it kind of feels that way sometimes, but like, it is really an important part of how people like enact their identity in the world. And so it makes sense that there's so much, so many structures and frameworks and imposed ideas upon gender and how it like plays out. And so, as you said, you know, one of the ways that Matt Fradd connects into this part of the discussion is through his early focus on being against pornography in his advocacy and his speaking. He has said on another podcast that he was on, I think it was he was speaking with Trent Horn, so I believe it was either the Catholic Answers podcast or Trent Horn's podcast, that he doesn't mind being called the porn guy because so much of his early work and early ministry focused on confronting pornography. So Matt actually did work directly with Catholic Answers, and he started in 2012. And when he started there, he was wanting to speak specifically on pornography in high schools, but the response was kind of tepid in the beginning, and schools were preferring a more general chastity talk. But just a few years later, demand for his anti-porn presentations skyrocketed, reflecting a cultural shift in how these issues were being perceived. And I will say, like, definitely as the internet became more of a thing that everybody was on all the time, I think that is definitely when pornography became much more of a discussed about topic in Catholic spaces from my own perspective. Like, we always had, you know, in youth groups and at youth retreats, there would always be different chastity talks that we've discussed before, more purity culture focused for women that Emma has had experiences with, and then definitely more lust and temptation based discussions for men, but definitely porn became more of a big conversation as the internet started to like take over all of life. And then now we have these little phones that are with us all the time connected to the internet and all that. And so Fradd's framing around pornography was not just as a moral failing, but as a neurological and behavioral concern. He looked at over 50 neuroscience-based studies arguing that pornography can be addictive, affecting the brain similarly to substance abuse. He used this framework to address men in particular, linking pornography consumption to sexual dysfunction, dissatisfaction, and relational harm. He wrote a book called The Porn Myth, created a 21-day detox program, and worked with accountability software like Covenant Eyes, tying morality, behavior, and this idea of like personal discipline together. Critically, this focus on pornography became the first step in building a highly gendered platform. By centering young men as the primary audience and framing their struggles with pornography as a moral and spiritual battlefield, Fradd's work reinforces strict hierarchical ideas about masculinity and authority, elements central to what we talk about as high control Catholicism. Over time, the platform expanded into the long-form podcasts like Love People Use Things and The Matt Fradd Show and Pints with Aquinas, where these discussions could reach a national audience. Looking at this through a broader lens, this approach intersects with Catholic nationalism and online radicalization. Young men encountering Fradd's content are introduced to tightly bound moral frameworks that mix faith, gender, and authority, sometimes converging with reactionary political ideologies. The anti-porn focus then becomes a gateway, a place of shame and personal feelings of like there's something wrong with me, I'm broken, that then what the rest of the platform that Fradd presents is kind of the solution. So this idea that I'm broken, I'm bad, but here's like a group, here's a community of people, here's like a brotherhood. I believe if you go to theporneffect.com, it'll take you to strive21.com, which says over 120,000 men strong join Matt Fradd and a community of brothers in discovering the keys to living porn-free with the Strive 21-day porn detox. So I think it's incredibly relevant that there's this idea that there's something wrong with you, and then you can find freedom. They use the word freedom on this page as well, through brotherhood. So all those words are super loaded in this context because it's the kind of group. Let's see here. How do I want to put this? It's not like if I were to join a jiu-jitsu studio where, they're teaching me general rules and practices for a way of life, and I can go there and interact and have a community, but it's separate from the rest of my life. Like I can go to jiu-jitsu or a martial arts and I can learn these skills, right? It's learning the similar skills and benefiting from community. I can learn skills of integrating with other people, solving conflicts, dealing with my own emotions, emotional management. When you're in a jiu-jitsu headlock and you're just there, you kind of just have to like be present. There's nothing you can do. But it's distinct, in these more religious-based environments, because a religious-based group like that is everything. You can never like leave the group, really. Like you're never not part of the group. It's always going to be affecting you.
I love how you said that. And I just want to like verbally highlight what you said, that I think there is a difference and an importance in highlighting that with Fradd and others creating this specifically religious-based Manoverse, that there's an incredibly present and precedent danger, is that because of spirituality for all of us, for many people who are people of faith, is a end justifies a means and the way in which we enact and gain salvation, then everything is worth sacrificing, in much the same way that violence is being used to justify these groups. And violence is being used to justify this if ideas and traditions surrounding gender roles and ways in which people act and engage with one another is viewed as inherently sacred or sacramental.
I think it also is really interesting because I think there's a connection as well when you're discussing something in the spiritual realm. There's already a need for example, like a moral imagination, and a lot of different traditions of prayer. I've heard Father Jim Martin talk about in Ignatian spirituality this idea of like imagining yourself sitting beside Jesus. So there's already sort of, you know, enriching your inner life by visualizing and things like that. I think another thing that I think of with this group particularly is when you have this idealization and perhaps even idolization, but both, not just idealizing, but also idolizing these sort of mythic masculine figures. They're pushing that idealization and idolization beyond reality, and instead of, for example, looking at something like the Crusades, where you have these holy knights. Okay, that sounds great on the surface. Like, I'm a dude who loves Catholicism. I want to be a holy knight. But you're idealizing it beyond like the actual human toll and the actual realities of the situation. You're not looking at it complexly at all. You're like, well, they were just knights for Christ, and that's what I want to be. But like, what does that actually mean? There is a real danger there in cosplaying as something that is a pure fantasy, that is a militarization that has very real consequences in the real world on violence enacted on vulnerable people, which, spoilers, is completely divorced from what Jesus was about.
And Max, I want to emphasize just what you said because I think that's critical. It's also tied to this idea that within Catholic and Christian manosphere areas, within Manoverse discussions, this is also tied to who and how people interpret Jesus to be, whether that be a hyper masculine appearance, whether it be a Jesus with a bunch of abs, or a pointedly white, jacked out Jesus. This also ties to the idea that this is not only about a way in which Jesus is himself a model of Catholic hypermasculinity, but also how the policies of the church are in line with and supporting a Catholic hypermasculinity and far right Catholic nationalism, which we know is untrue historically to what the Gospels have been saying, but it's very much tied into the idea that there is a religious justification behind this. So just as you say, the men who go out and cosplay and seek to be crusaders, a number of political figures have tattoos that allude to some of the first crusaders. In ancient Catholic iconography is an idea that in tying themselves back to these figures, they can fulfill and justify their own actions of violence towards marginalized communities today in line with crusader actions against targeted Islamic communities and Jewish communities during the medieval period. And as we know, the Crusades were awful. The church has apologized for the campaign of violence that was waged against it. So trying to glorify these figures as emblematic of Jesus waging a holy war is deeply scary and problematic.
Absolutely. I really like how you tied that together and made that point, Emma. That was really well said.
Thank you.
I also wanted to add, I feel like this is also why disciplines and fields such as queer liberation theology are so important, because we're not just asking the question, what's happening or why is this happening? We are saying, look at the way that the frameworks that exist allow this as an option. And we talked about that a little bit with Dr. Joan Braun, where she talked about the idea of a live option, which is basically, in your life, there are certain things that you do believe you might do, but there are other things that you don't believe would really happen or you would really do. So the example she gave when we talked to her on the episode on fighting fascism was, for her, a live option is getting a tattoo. She doesn't have one, but maybe she would get one. So that's a live option. But she was raised Catholic and Christian, so converting to Hinduism is not something that she would consider to be like a live option. And so I really think that, like, that's why I'm drawing to queer liberation theology in this context, is what I'm really wanting to say is, like, that is why, we want to use theology to examine and present a path forward where the live option isn't, I'm going to become a crusader and I'm going to, like, kill or exclude or vote out anybody who isn't my one theocratic vision of what, Catholicism is supposed to be. Like, we already know that's not what the church is about, because the popes are literally saying this is not what it's about. But the fact that it is a live option is a problem. And something like queer liberation theology is an option to address that, is what I'm wanting to say.
So well said. And I think this also ties to the idea of inherently what the red pill theology and culture is all about. Is it's about entertaining or providing oxygen and space for misogynistic, patriarchal violence culture to exist and persist. So much of the not only the first and second, but especially the third, fourth, and fifth wave feminist movements are targeting the ways in which the privilege that white men believe is inherently endowed to them, often within this sphere of influence of Catholic theology, is divinely ordained by God, is something that has been deconstructed and challenged. It's not meant to challenge the rights of white men within society, the protections that we believe they should be afforded along with every other person. But the idea of entertaining the notion that men's rights YouTubers, that the idea that men should own women's bodies or have control over reproductive decisions, over gender affirming care, over the treatment of immigrants within the United States. It's providing space and oxygen to an incredibly volatile and difficult movement that is allowing far-right political figures to gain unprecedented support and viability within the political sphere. And that's the scary part, is that in entertaining and creating, as you say, a live option of this idea, it's allowing men the space to question what they believe they are owed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so we can see how Matt Fradd fits into that really well, with beginning with pornography as, like, the area that he started, because you can see how digital platforms, like the podcast and the YouTube that he has, can cultivate an influential space where the religious messaging, the gender expectations, and the radicalization of young men intersect. So what starts as a moral campaign against pornography becomes, in effect, a blueprint for shaping how these young Catholic men see themselves, their faith, and their role in the wider world, everything that we just said. And so I just want to make a few points about online radicalization itself, because I think it's helpful to keep in mind, or to refer to within this conversation. I think most people know that online radicalization is a thing as a big picture view, primarily because we all experienced the pandemic going through COVID-19, and we all saw the absolutely unhinged things that were, like, coming up, and we saw people that, family members or people that we knew, posting things that were very questionable, that didn't align with, the reality or with science. And so I think a lot of us understand that it's very easy, again, with this idea of fantasy. The internet is like fantasy land in general. Like, it's very easy to just, get lost. And it can be something harmless too. Like, sometimes I just watch these videos of random people building random things. I don't even know what they're building. I don't even have any context. I'm just watching these videos. There's like a little bit of like it's stimulating, right? Like the sound of them hammering, or like watching them, and it's satisfying to see them build something. But those same mechanisms of how that's stimulating my brain are also utilized by these conspiracies. And those things also intrigue us because, we want to know, we're curious, like, well, what do they mean about that? Or if it activates, fear, or if it activates something that feels personal to us. And so, again, tying it into religion, you can see how it becomes even more personal, even more intensely impactful. And so some of the key dynamics when it comes to online radicalization, specifically of young men, since that's the focus of this discussion, first of all, is just the fact that young men are already vulnerable. There's already so much messaging that makes it so difficult for young men to develop into well-rounded people, because it's like, well, I have to enact hyper masculine performances at all time. I can't cry. I can't express any weakness. So there's already vulnerability in young men, and also needing mentors and role models. If they don't have one, what are they looking towards? Secondly, the role of online spaces. And so it's not just the internet writ large, it's social media specifically, forums, um, chat rooms, or like chat platforms like Discord, and also Discord connects with gaming. And so these are efficient and low cost methods for extremist groups to reach out to potential recruits. It also ties into something we talked about in our Fighting Fascism episode with Dr. Joan Braun on the topic of the role of social movements. She talks about how, fascism will create social movements, will do things that appear to be community services, like community organizing potluck in the park, or things like that seem on the surface fine or good. It's only later that you realize they're completely excluding certain people, and and worse. But she talks about how you need positive social movements to take their place. And so my point just being that, the radicalization can feed through creating a social movement. So now it's, we are together gaming, and then now we're having discussions about how women are not, valuable. Women just think that they are real people, but really only men are real people. That's a Timothy Gordon special. He's one
Yeah.
of these Catholic influencers. Um, and then also the role of algorithms, which has also been studied, and you can look this up very easily, that algorithms will feed you increasingly extreme content, which create echo chambers, and also, send you down conspiracy rabbit holes. Um, so then, the other elements in the radicalization of someone, especially young men, I think we've kind of touched on the last couple items here. So there's search for identity and belonging. That's really important. That's where the brotherhood thing comes in. That's where I like the expression of talking about it as white male discontent, because I think that really captures what's at the heart of it. It's this idea of like, well, there's no opportunities for me. Like, it's so hard for me because all these diverse people, all the DEI things, like everyone else is going to take the opportunities, and what am I going to do? But honestly, there's entitlement in that. There's this idea that I should be the center. I should be getting all the opportunities. But why? What makes you think that you are more deserving than other people?
100%, or ignoring the history of exclusion. So part of this is because their fathers, their grandfathers, their great grandfathers always had easy access not only to financial opportunities, to land, to job opportunities, to women's bodies, often without consent, is the
Mm-hmm.
expectation that they are owed these things. But in actuality, it denies the fact that historically women, marginalized communities, have been systematically excluded and harmed by these systems. It wasn't something they were owed, it was a privilege that put down other people.
100%. And then, then there's the exploitation of religion and masculine crisis narrative. So, these things we have touched on, but there's often this idea that there's a masculinity crisis. That's kind of like the mask that is put over the more radical and exclusionary beliefs. But it's this idea, well, men are just lost, and men need purpose, and men need this. And so that is something that, like, again, if you are, a young boy and you feel like the world is hostile, like if you're just feeling that, hearing this you're gonna latch onto that and be like, oh, well, they're explaining it for me, so I'm gonna go along with. And then suddenly it's a snowball, it's a domino effect into more and more. And so then the radicalization can happen. It can happen quite quickly, especially if it just latches right into your identity in that way. And then we know that it connects to real world violence. Despite the fact that many people who are far right are continually trying to pin the real world violence that happens, like gun violence, on vulnerable, marginalized communities, the data does not support that in terms of the actual evidence of who is often behind these acts of terror and violence.
Absolutely. And this connects to the idea that often when we talk about Matt Fradd and his transition to the Daily Wire, people are curious about what this means. There's often a question about what does this have to do in any way with Christian and Catholic nationalism? What does this have to do with the Manoverse? I know we got into the latter portion earlier on in the episode, and I hope that connection is clearer now. But this also connects to the idea that Matt Fradd himself targets younger men, not only boys, but also college age men that are kind of adrift and looking for leadership and guidance in a world that is challenging the privilege that they believe they're owed. And as a result of that, he is bringing this to a much larger audience and bringing his audience into a much more radicalized far right political pipeline. As a result, there's great similarities between the work that he does in connecting through conferences he spoke at, including Seek, with college students, as Charlie Kirk, who was really active on college and university campuses. And actively inviting people to debate. In fact, Charlie Kirk, who was killed in September, many far right and moderately conservative Catholic outlets have hypothesized that he was almost Catholic himself. Whether or not that's true, again, Charlie can't clarify his faith because he's gone. But but it ties to the fact that many outlets know that his wife, Erica Kirk, is Catholic. She held up a rosary when she was arriving to greet her husband's body. A far right Christian nationalist held up a rosary at Charlie Kirk's funeral. There are all these elements that try to tether him not only to Christian nationalism, but also more to this Catholic nationalism. And even after his death, he's become a lightning rod for people that followed him and are now following him into a radicalized view of faith and political violence. In much the same way, J.D. Vance, as we know, is a Catholic convert. So there's a whole ton that revolves around this of J.D. Vance himself being someone who wasn't intimately involved in religion, but like many far-right political and celebrity figures, including Shia LaBeouf, Steve Bannon, a number of figures that have kind of entered and spirited this far-right Catholic nationalist ecosystem. He entered this frame and has become a lightning rod for young Catholic men and Catholic nationalists as a representation in the highest echelons of American government. It also ties to this past week, he himself openly criticized his wife and hoped that she would convert to Christianity, was seen closely and intimately hugging Erica Kirk, and there's speculation all online, which we won't add to, about their potential relationship. But it also ties to growing concern about how the transition of this one figure who has a huge following with Pints is going to not only affect Catholic Manoverse cover and growing allegiance within the sphere, but also the number of men who are pulled, sometimes unwillingly, into political echo chambers. And it's a risk not only for young men, but for the church writ large, because it's using ideas of men's rights philosophies. It's using ideas of theology and spiritual grounding in order to justify intense violence against marginalized communities today.
100%. I think there's also, I'm just thinking, reflecting, there is a connection here, but this, I feel like it's going to feel like out of nowhere a little. On the idea of the devil's advocate.
Yes. Charlie Kirk. Yeah.
100%. 100%. But I was just looking at a tweet showing something that Matt Walsh just recently talked about. And Matt Walsh is a Catholic who has a show on the Daily Wire as well. So Matt Fradd will be, a colleague now of Matt Walsh. So I guess Matt Walsh is being called out for making blatantly false and discriminatory comments about SNAP recipients and disbelieving that those missing out on benefits can't just rely on friends, family, and soup kitchens. And so I say the devil's advocate because in thinking about that, it's like, basically, why? Like, why would you ever say that someone doesn't deserve to be fed? Right? And the only way that you really get there is by playing the devil's advocate. And I think that that is, again, with this whole concept of the live option, like, why are we allowing and platforming people who are literally just playing the devil's advocate to such a degree that they're forming these impressionable minds into people that then, are cosplaying as if that reality that they've created that's a fantasy is real. And that's where you get as well the people who the young men, but also the people, not just men, who use this Christ is king as a rallying call. I mean, it's really hard to miss the symbolism there. This the king thing, this idea that of an attraction to a theocracy once again. And it's also just one other example that's of how this all comes together. We've seen even the Pope again speaking against a lot of the policies that we see emerging from the convergence of these cultural and religious and political identities in the US. So the Pope denouncing the Trump and Vance decision to block the Eucharist from ICE detention centers. Christopher Hale reached out to a White House spokesperson for comment, and they said the Pope doesn't know what he's talking about. So just once again, suddenly now the devil's advocate guy who is saying things that aren't even attached to reality doesn't know what he's talking about at all, has no authority or expertise on Snap. Suddenly those people are valued more highly in terms of their contributions than the Pope within this world. And so this is what we're talking about as far as like what these types of things lead to.
Absolutely. And it's the idea, and I also want to highlight that it's not only this idea of devil's advocacy, it's the idea of policing social civility. And I think that was a huge piece of Charlie Kirk and Matt Fradd's work, is it's the expectation that not only are we going to entertain and give oxygen to discussions about what it means to be an authentic man, but it's also questioning the idea and providing space just to think and challenge someone who would then assert that, just as you said, this isn't gospel truth, that Jesus wanted people fed, Jesus wanted people housed, Jesus wanted people clothed and viewed with innate and inherent human dignity. But when those conversations are brought up, there's often the response when people are playing often Jesus's advocate to their devil's advocate that, we have to respect with civility people who are expressing their worldviews. And there's a difference in between expressing worldviews and openly challenging and threatening the livelihood and dignity of other people. So it's often the mistake and often the reason that people provide oxygen and entertain the policies of the Manoverse, because people that are encountering those challenges say, well, we can still have a debate. We can still talk about and have a conversation on equal footing. But in spaces like this, where young men are saying that there's only one form of Catholicism, there is only one person who should have access and control over a woman's body, that trans people or intersex people or non-binary people don't exist. We can't have an equal footing discussion or an equal grounded discussion, because that denies the innate human dignity of all people.
Mm-hmm. And that ties really well into this idea. We wrote an essay, you and I, Emma, wrote an essay for Substack called Charlie Kirk and the Illusion of Debate. And I really like that title because I think that really encompasses a lot of what these guys are doing, many clips were circulating after the death of Charlie Kirk. And the point that was made by so many people was, okay, yeah, let's side by side. Let's look at what it was like when he was just on college campuses talking to kids compared to when he actually was in a real debate forum. And when he had people who really knew how to debate and really gave him pushback, he didn't know what to do because his toolkit was about, basically the same toolkit that JD Vance uses and Donald Trump uses. It's basically like deny, avoid, like attack. Like if I can't do one of those three things, then I can't do anything. And I have seen this personally. So, I am a transgender man and a Catholic, and I'm online, I'm on social media, and I have seen it in the comment section when I say something that people from these groups don't like. It's ad hominem attacks immediately. It's your opinion, Max, is not valid because you're transgender. Like, and then they then as well, it's not just that, it's also I'm going to dehumanize you by saying cruel things about you or towards you or describing you in a disrespectful way. And so I think that illusion of debate thing is really important here. Sort of this, again, cosplaying. So all the followers, they want to cosplay as the knights and the crusaders, but I think that the leaders, they want to cosplay as if they're like brilliant deep thinkers. And it's like, we talk about Aquinas and Socrates, Aristotle. We talk about them because they were great thinkers. We will probably be talking about these people like Kirk and Fradd and Matt Walsh later, but not because they were great thinkers, but because of the great harms that they allowed to become normalized. Because again, the normalization is also a huge concern here. And so, the behavior we tolerate is the behavior that shapes our communities. A lot of people often erroneously shield some of their family members from criticisms around these things because they don't want to believe that somebody that they care about has been drawn into this. And also, they don't realize that silence and inattention can allow even more radicalizing influence to take hold. Charisma isn't harmless. It's not neutral. How you use your charisma is really important, and I think at the end of the day, that's kind of like my greatest disappointment with these figures is that like I can clearly see that you are someone who had charisma and influence, and I just feel so disappointed that these people have chosen to use it again to play the devil's advocate. Like you had all this potential and all this passion and all this ability, and you put it into that. Like, what would have happened if you had put it into something good?
Same. I think of the same thing. And also, I want to emphasize that just as this idea of charisma alone is not neutral, so is the devil's advocate not neutral. So is the idea of civility not a neutral thing inherently. And so is the idea that Matt Fradd is switching over to the Daily Wire not a neutral decision, nor is it one that is focused solely on his career and will only have implications for him. It's a connection of his young audience with a pipeline for radicalization that we know. So being cognizant about how this move is significant is critical because when it's overlooked and there isn't a consciousness of how Catholic men influencers are impacting the growth of Catholic nationalism, we deny not only the history of radicalization, throughout the United States, but also throughout the history of the Catholic Church, but also the ways in which we are all responsible for creating off ramps and stopping radicalization where we see it forming.
I'm so glad we had this conversation today, Emma, and that we were able to share these reflections with everyone because I know that you and I, we really enjoy being able to see the connections and make them and call them out because we understand that that's the first step in helping to create broader networks of safety networks, safety nets. When we call this out, it creates the awareness that helps people to keep an eye out. I think that again, just assuming that what someone like Kirk did was legitimate debate is dangerous because we want to make sure that we can show these connections. As we draw to a close here, I just wanted to ask you, do you have any final words that we can land on here?
I think the big thing The big thing to emphasize is that I think there's often a tendency to think about, well, if I can't turn to Matt Fradd and other individuals within these spheres that are offering opportunities to grow and learn about what it means to be a man and what manhood is within the Catholic Church, who can I turn to? And you and I, Max, have explored that there are a number of healthy models of masculinity. Masculinity that prioritizes emotional awareness, integrity, a commitment to social justice and liberation theology that is lived and fights a power, not in the favor of white supremacist or Catholic nationalist power, but rather fighting for the liberation of marginalized people. Look to Pope Leo, especially. That's a critical example. But to let people know that this doesn't have to be a sole option. And just as we don't want to entertain or provide oxygen and space to Manoverse philosophies, we also need to provide outlets for young Catholic men to imagine not only a future for themselves within the church, but also a future for themselves in which they maybe are taking some of this energy and excitement to fight for a world they want to create, to make it a world that is inclusive to everyone. That's it for today's episode. Matt Fradd's move might seem like just another career step, but as we've talked about, it highlights bigger trends in Catholic media, masculinity culture, and online radicalization.
Exactly. Whether you're Catholic, interested in media trends, or just paying attention to how faith and politics collide online, this is a space worth watching. These shifts have real implications for how young people form their beliefs and identities.
Thanks for listening. If you're following along, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes where we unpack more intersections of faith, culture, and power.
And as always, we'd love to hear from you. What do you think about this growing Catholic Manoverse and how it's shaping conversations about masculinity and faith?
Feel free to drop us a comment, reach out to us on social media, or continue to follow our work on Substack. We really appreciate all of your support and continued engagement. Goodbye!